Welcome. I'm Richard Moran, and we're going to be interviewing Austin Turk this morning for the American Society of Criminology's project in oral history. To my immediate right is Professor Austin Turk, and to his right is Professor Hugh Barlow from Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville.
Austin, you've had a very distinguished career. You began, I believe, with your PhD at the University of Wisconsin, moved to Indiana University, and from there you've been to quite a few places, some exotic places too, I understand, visiting professorships in South Africa, for example. Can we just talk for a minute about your graduate days at Wisconsin? Who did you do your work under?
That's a very good question. I was, before Wisconsin, doing a master's degree at Kentucky, which is a little story in itself, where my master's thesis supervisor was John Ball, who thought after I had finished my master's there was nothing more for me really to learn at Kentucky. He thought I should go elsewhere, and particularly I should go to Wisconsin to study under Marshall Clenard. I arrive at Wisconsin. Marshall is the first year in India, the second year in Sweden, so I never had a course with Marshall. I worked with a variety of people. I thought I would be a theorist. I worked with Howard Paul Becker, who died in 1961. I had to decide what I would do. I got an NIMH predoctoral fellowship to study delinquency in urban areas, and did that work basically with the tutelage and counseling of Lyle Shannon.
So after you finished your PhD, you went to Indiana University, I believe.
That's right.
And you rose fairly quickly through the ranks, I understand. A full professor in about 5 years, is that?
Well, it's full professor in 8 years.
8 years. Still very fast, yes. Do you
Yeah,
have memories of your Indiana days? You did some
definitely.
important work there. I think that's where you wrote the Crime, Criminality, and Legal Order, isn't it?
Yes, I did. I went to Indiana, where they had a traditional threesome of Edwin Sutherland, Alfred Lindesmith, and Albert Cohen. Each had a division of labor going, and because of Sutherland's early demise, they had a vacancy for a general criminologist to teach general criminology courses. Corrections and drugs being covered by Lindy, and delinquency obviously being covered by Al Cohen. So I show up teaching criminology. I become very unhappy with the available textbooks of the time. They didn't make any sense to me. The 60s were upon us. There was all kinds of turmoil erupting, and the books were still talking about psychopathic individuals and trying to explain individual criminal behavior or acts by referring to individual personality quirks or genes or whatever. So I started looking around for something better, and of course I had already in mind, having picked up on George Voll's theoretical criminology while a student at Wisconsin, I thought that conflict theory, which was an obvious antidote to the kind of mindless structural functionalism that was dominant during that time. This was the option. This was the alternative, and to me, in my whole experience, it made more sense. I tried to write a book that would sort of apply, basically, George Vold and some Ralph Dorendorf on social conflict theory, which I'd picked up on. And I tried to pull together whatever evidence was available that made sense to me of what the criminal justice process amounted to in dealing with various parts of the population. So as you may recall, I tried to work out what I called criminality rates, making no assumptions about whether they did it or not, but criminality rates to talk about the variations among racial and age and gender groupings in terms of their arrest rates and other indicators of their official deviance
So
status.
you moved away from crime as behavior to
right.
crime as a status, in effect.
Precisely.
Yeah. And that book really was very well received, wasn't it? It not only was it well received because it produced some new ideas and developed some new ideas, but it was put together very well. It was a very good example of theory construction, I think, of which there was very little in those days.
Yes, I was a little tired by then of what I called theorizing, which in some place I wrote was the pursuit of unexplored subtleties. So at some point it seemed to me, you've got enough ideas to work with, you should try to arrange them in some systematic and rigorous order. And I tried to develop that particular book as really a system of hypotheses about variations in what I called criminality rates. And people should look in particular at variations involving class. I argued that the assumption that you always test first is whether there are class variations. You assume that the disadvantaged will be more vulnerable to labeling than the relatively advantaged. And then you look at what kinds of normative categories are being used to classify them as they run afoul of the police and other first-level enforcers, as I call them, which in those days I meant to include psychiatrists, the people who screened and diagnosed people for having mental illness, which to me was an abnormality category which was in no significant way distinguishable from the more obvious criminal, so-called criminal law categories.
And you also suggested that rates of criminality will vary according to certain characteristics of the enforcers and some of the characteristics of the subordinates.
Oh yes, I had ideas about the extent to which the words, as I put it, the cultural norms expressed in the laws were in fact matched by the behavioral norms, or as I call them, the social norms, of not only those who did or did not run afoul of the law, but also of those whose job it was to interpret and enforce the law. So the social norms of the police, for example, were, to my mind, not necessarily congruent with the cultural norms as expressed in the written laws, in statutes, or even in judicial decisions.
But also, if you had, let's say, among the subordinates a desire to smoke marijuana and the officials or the authorities said that's okay, presumably there's no criminality there. But if they disagree on whether the behavior is acceptable and disagree strongly enough, that would be an instance in which you'd have conflict and therefore...
Indeed. I saw all instances of someone having been, in my jargon, criminalized, which might or might not involve formal arrest, obviously. I saw this as, in each instance, a conflict between those who were asserting authority and those who were subject to those assertions to a greater or lesser degree.
Did you coin the term criminalization? Do you know?
I think I probably did, except that there were some analogs in the older literature which had to do with criminal maturation and so on. So, but criminalization as a term for official labeling, as I came to call it, yes, I coined that. I had an earlier version of that concept which didn't fly very well. When I did my PhD dissertation, I came up with the idea of illegitimation.
Oh.
Illegitimation, and at that time, Howie Becker came out with Outsiders and made labeling the thing, following up on pardon me, Edwin Limmert's work. And of course, Howie's labeling made a lot more sense, was a lot easier to follow than the notion of illegitimation.
How would you, mentioning Becker and Kitsuza, you obviously would include, I suppose, in that group of scholars who began to develop labeling theory in the early 60s. How would you place yourself in that context? Because we're talking here about the development of a sort of social reality of crime through the process of labeling. Dick Quinney comes out with stuff about the same time as yours.
That's right.
Did you see yourself in the midst of this very exciting period? How did you feel?
I guess I did. What we had all been trying to do was to break the mold of traditional criminology and traditional sociology of deviance studies. In fact, the notion of deviance as a specialty in its own right arose in large part as a breakaway from criminology. There's people who were not happy with being restricted to the boundaries set by criminal law in deciding what was done, and also didn't wish to be restricted by the official identifications of people as deviant or not. So they broke away from official labeling. You remember things like Ciccarel and Kitsusi writing about notes on the shortcomings, basically, of using official records. to identify what's
Yeah.
really going on in terms of who is on the receiving end of more or less punitive labeling by the authorities, particularly the police and the juvenile courts as they got
Which
into it.
provoked Jack Gibbs, of course, to argue that, well, there's still something going on that avoids the label. It doesn't get labeled. What do we do with that?
Well, it was an interesting time to be trying to sort out these issues, and there were those who said, well, there's nothing new here, that of course they decide on the basis of evidence and so on whether or not the criminal label applies, for example. And the labelers, of course, including many of us so-called conflict theorists by then, began saying, but no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a process over time, and in particular, a historically embedded process. We're not talking about one-time labeling. And some of the early stuff did sort of say, well, if the cops grabbed the kid was traumatized for life, the self-concept was somehow warped, and bang, they had to go further into career deviance. Now, we tried to emphasize that not only that in the case of individual careers, which is where I think most of the interactionists stopped, basically, looking at individuals in their life careers of getting into trouble and the effects it had on them and so on. We were trying to get to the point where we could talk about collective deviance, the deviance as labeled of whole subpopulations or parts of a population. There we were trying to hook this into the race relations literature, the class analysis literature, and so on. Those were the days before there was much of anything on gender discrimination. As many people pointed out, over the years there was virtual absence of any attention in any systematic way to female criminality or female crime or female deviance in the literature of the time.
I know Richard probably wanted to ask a question in a minute, but let me just follow up with one last point about this book, because I know I've said it and I know other folks have observed it. It was about 20 years before tests of the theory. You never were able to complete a test. As I recall, the books sort of, you did some initial inferential kinds of testing, but
within
actually
the book, basically,
within the
yes.
book. But then after that, nothing for
Nothing
a long
much
time.
I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One, that I was moving on with a lot of other things, particularly a developing interest in political crime and political policing. And also, you mentioned the book was well received. Initially, I don't think it was particularly well received. I know that the book was published when I was working in South Africa. And one of the things that I ran into when I came back to the States in 1969 was that people were saying, well, the book is out, that's nice. And then I saw a review in one of the last issues of the American Sociological Review to contain reviews. Before that time, Marv Olson and I actually became the co-editors of the book review section of the ASR, and our recommendation, along with that of Jay Demarath, was to create a new journal. We had more business than we could handle. So what happened was that in my absence in Africa, Marvin, who was a participatory Democrat in those days, decided he would find the most obscure people to review books rather than ask people in the field, basically, who were known. So he found some person who was teaching at a small college in, I think it was California somewhere, and asked her, whose name I don't remember, to review the book. She didn't like it at all. She said, it's a terrible book. It makes no sense, and if you like taxonomies, maybe you'll find something here, but there's really nothing in this book. It was a scathing review and a rejection of the book. So that was the first review I ever saw of it.
Well, some of us liked it. But what about these tests now? The recent work by Lanza Caduce.
I think in many ways Lanza Caduce has done the most insightful testing of the book. That is, he did not misconstrue some of what I had to say and then say that, well, that doesn't make any sense, or that it's been said better somewhere else by somebody else. He did a very honest and accurate derivation of testable hypotheses.
And where does it stand now? Do you still stand by the theory? Do you still believe that this is a...
I think there are a number of things. Yes, I think I should have done more about attempting to test myself. After all, I criticized people such as Parsons for arguing that there was a fundamental division of labor between us theorists who have to get on with the high-level stuff and guys who have to figure out how to test it, which is the lower-level stuff. The division of labor between theorists and researchers, he said, in responding to his own critics.
Yeah.
Well, it's not up to me to bother with the empirical evidence. I never thought that. I never thought that at all. It's just that I was always interested in too many things at a time, I guess. I think that criminality and legal order would have been much improved if I hadn't, if I'd waited a few more years and written it, and written a longer book, perhaps. It was, I did use, for simplicity's sake, authorities versus subjects. Every conflict was sort of following Dahrendorf. It resolved into a two-party conflict. Well, things are much more complex than that, and I hinted at it in the book by talking about first level and higher level enforcers and so on. But I didn't really spell it out in terms of different levels or kinds of authorities, much less talk about in any systematic ways the various kinds of conflicts that as they erupt in legislation, relationship between legislation, legislatures and the judiciary, judiciary vis-a-vis prosecutors, prosecutors, police. The details very much needed unpacking, at least conceptually, even at that point. So I think that's probably a very important shortcoming of that work.
Austin, could you tell us how you came to study criminology? How did you get into the field? What was it about criminology that attracted you?
How far back should we go? One of my earliest memories is sitting on the top of a very long series of steps in a house we lived in when I was a little kid. And I was a preschooler at some point, watching about maybe 200 yards away, watching the police fight with a man they were putting into the county jail, which was just across the street down there. It was my first glimpse of law enforcement. But more seriously, later on, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Georgia, I had a very good introductory criminology course with Ray Payne. And he thought I should go to graduate school, and I became increasingly interested. And during that period at the University of Georgia, I managed to get a job, beginning as a civilian employee and then going on and working with the police in my hometown of Gainesville, Georgia for almost 3 years as a major source of income to pay my way through college. By the time I had gotten involved in that, I was increasingly interested in criminology and went to University of Kentucky at Lexington, where I met John Ball, and John Ball took me under his tutelage, and I did my master's degree with him, helped him with his MMPI studies of adolescents and delinquents, and didn't like doing that stuff very much, and as I said before, went off then to Wisconsin and worked with Lyle Shannon, but in Clenard's absence also with, particularly with Mike Hakim, who taught me to critique forensic psychiatry's writings, and Frank Hartung, who taught me to question everything about the social psychology of riots and this, that, and the other. That was then received wisdom.
What about, this 3 years that you spent in the police department? It seems to me that was your interest in then becoming in law enforcement, becoming a cop, or was this purely kind of
no, if anything, that convinced me that I definitely did not want a career as a cop. It was actually a relatively enlightened and civilized police force to be working on in those days. Very good chief who would never, as I told someone a couple of years ago, never have tolerated something like the Rodney King beating. This was not his idea of doing things. In those days, I have to put it the other way too, the blacks were generally afraid of the police, and traditionally for good reason. So there was rarely any violence. Most of the violence involved white rednecks.
Now, when you were that little boy watching the police arrest this man,
yes.
What was the? It's interesting to me. What was the image that you had of the police? Is it an image that they were your protectors, that they were people that you had to fear, that they were in conflict with your community?
My reaction at first, as near as I can recall, this was simply, it was another curiosity, things that happen in the world. and watching them take this person struggling. I didn't quite understand it. I'd never had a fight at that point. I didn't know anything about this. As far as my experiences in the police were concerned, I, as I said, did not ever intend to go into law enforcement as a career. But I did become increasingly alert to if sometimes the actuality, but certainly always the potential for police abuse of power. These are the days of the segregated South we're talking about, the last days of the segregated South. And this is 2 years after I leave there, the police force is integrated, for example, for the first time ever. The kind of chief I was working for, Chief Henry, apparently had a meeting, as some of my friends still on the force told me, had a meeting, says we're going to, I've hired 2 fine young, as he would have said, Negra men to be on the police force. Anybody that doesn't like it, get the hell off my police force. So 2 resignations, and that's how they integrated the police force in that town. They'd integrated the schools in similar fashion just before, right after the 54 decisions, but not long after they integrated, beginning with the little kids, and as they did in those days, working up to the grades. And he had gone to the Ku Klux Klan and told them to stay away from the schools or else. And then he went and told the more militant black community people what he had told the Ku Kluxers, and asked them, told them basically to stay away from the schools also. So nobody showed up to do any kind of protesting or counter-protesting at the schools, and that's how they desegregated the schools. So it was an extraordinary place to be into police work, but I did see enough of old-fashioned policing, of brutal policing at times, about which I could do nothing, to convince me that there were some major problems, and there were connections. Even then I sensed there were some connections between what police did and how people eventually came to behave collectively. I also at that time began to be aware that there was another country in the world that was very similar, which was South Africa in many ways. Somebody once asked me after I'd spent a good bit of time in South Africa what the place was like, and then when I was there, particularly toward the end of the 60s, I said it was as if in those days George Wallace was bad, you see. George Wallace and Joe McCarthy together were running the country.
I know that the South African analogy, we've talked about the strategy of containment of a population, of course, was much different than what happened here in the U.S. How did that maybe you could share with us some of those observations on their crime control strategies?
I saw those strategies up close, might say, over quite a period of time that I spent off and on in South Africa. I was generally accepted on the basis of labeling. That is, I would say I was there to study the crime problem, and so they would take me around with them or show me things and tell me things and give me access to documents, assuming that I mentioned was meaning simply the criminal behavior, the law-breaking activities of especially the Africans. No, I was actually studying the way the system of control operated is what I was focusing on. And this showed me that one can indeed accomplish quite a lot by terror. They were certainly capable of terrorizing the African population and used terror very deliberately as an intimidation weapon. They also had increasingly a tremendous array of laws to disarm the African population. At one point they passed something called the Dangerous Weapons Law, and this was typical of what was going on. When the police arrested an African for possessing a little pocket knife with about a 4-inch blade in it, the judge, whom I interviewed actually at one point, threw out the case. So they lost that case, but the police then did as they always did. They went to the Minister of Justice. The Minister of Justice went to the Parliament and got new legislation passed, which broadened their interpretive powers with respect to the laws. So it was increasing escalation of increasingly non-specific laws in terms of the discretionary power given to the police authorities. and the correctional authorities in how they would carry out their own mandates, which were clearly to maintain white control.
It seems to me, though, that, I mean, you had mentioned that when you first started teaching criminology at Wisconsin, that you were not satisfied with the kind of traditional positivist, structuralist functionalism that most criminology texts had. And it seems to me, if you look back on that early policing career and then your trips to South Africa, is this what made you see kind of process and enforcement and control where most people at that time were focusing on crime itself?
I suppose that had a great deal to do with it. I was not teaching criminology as such at Wisconsin, but certainly when I was teaching at Indiana and became unhappy with the state of the theoretical literature in the field, I was much more focused, obviously, on the control institutions and on the behavior of control agents than I was on trying to explain why some kid became a delinquent. So, to me, it always seemed rather obvious why you would get large numbers of young people who could not find employment, who had very little by way of support systems to encourage them to stay in school, who had hardly anywhere to go but the streets, who were always in need of money, and who were, in some cases, particularly objects of racial prejudice and discrimination. It was amazing to me that not all of them were stealing and getting into fights and being busted. So I didn't see it as so problematic. I thought that this was by and large predictable human behavior, that people who are certainly not stupid, who are aware that they are being discriminated against, that they are being oppressed, that others have opportunities which are denied to them, who eventually are losing hope altogether that things will ever get better, are going to be trouble, potentially or actually, for the authorities. And the authorities, I think, sense that. So it's, to me, predictable that there are going to be struggles, there are going to be periodic struggles. I used to suggest that it looked as though about every generation we would have a new round of conflict involving riots or whatever over these conditions. I believed for a long time, I guess, in the eruption theory. That it goes on so long, then I began to call it the forgetfulness theory, that each generation was sort of forgetting what the history was because they didn't know history. I've been amazed at this with some of my students now. I show them the Eyes on the Prize documentaries, and they have no idea. And I'm talking about African-American students in some instances. They have no idea that all that happened. They didn't know about the dogs and the fire hoses and so on. So if they forget, then they begin talking militantly again, and some people somewhere will eventually be disposed to riot against the police or to challenge the police. And this, of course, we know historically from all the riot studies and so on. We know this is always a losing proposition. Almost all the casualties are on the side of those who challenge the unjust system.
But there seems to be, in your early work there at least, and I think you have to think back from, today what you're saying is easily understood and everywhere taught. But if you go back to when you started writing, and this was a different perspective, and what I wanted to explore a little bit is how is it that a kind of a young person or a kid growing up tends to see process, see control when others don't see it? I mean, it's just something you felt you looked and that's the way you saw it. I mean, we're being taught today to see it that way.
I'm not sure. I mentioned the kind of upbringing I had. For example, we were not allowed to use the word nigger in our family. My grandfather, I've been with him on more than one occasion when the Ku Kluxers would parade through the black part of town. He would be there on the street corner telling them they were all heathen and they were going to hell for frightening these nice people, these poor people, as he put it, frightening these poor people. That he detested the Ku Klux Klan. So I grew up in a family that detested the Ku Klux Klan. So I began to see the ways in which the Ku Kluxers were attempting to dominate and control. I knew about lynchings from an early age. I heard about lynchings. I knew the history of neighboring Dawson and Forsyth counties. Very bad places indeed. And yes, Hugh?
Was it this sensitivity to race relations, to power, that drew you to South Africa in the first place?
In large part, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've
I'd seen much of this going on in the Deep South where I grew up, and then I saw there was this other place, and so I was going to go there at some point anyway, because my first wife was English South African.
Mm.
So there were those kinds of
Family
ties as
connection
well.
too, yeah.
Yes.
So what did you do in South Africa in those early years? You were doing research?
I was doing research. I was also a visiting scholar at Rhodes University, and then later on I was a visiting professor at the University of Natal. And during those times, yes, I was teaching. For a long time, I could say that I taught the last integrated criminology course in the University of Natal. It was an evening course taught at the downtown campus, downtown center, and I had 13 students, which included male and female, include colors, Afrikaner, English, and African, and Indian, I should say. Indian. I had everybody was represented one way or another in that class of 13 students. So I taught them the kinds of things that I had worked out in criminality and legal order.
Yeah. And South Africa's remained obviously an interest to you. I noticed that one of your works in progress right now is to look at changing conditions in policing in South Africa.
That's right. I call it policing the South African Revolution. And what interests me in particular there is the transformation and the problems involved, enormous problems involved in transforming a force which was organized and thoroughly indoctrinated and used to maintain apartheid. Now it is the police force of the new African-controlled government. And this has not been easy, and as we know, the policing the revolution continues. This revolution is not over, and everyone is waiting to see what happens when Mandela goes. There's nobody with anything like the moral authority that Mandela commands from most of the whites as well as Africans. So we shall see if they can keep it going in a progressive direction when the main catalyst for developments no longer is around. The problems of policing in a revolutionary situation is what I'm really focusing on more and more. I'm also been involved in this course of this project comparing the way in which the African Revolution was policed through use of terror and organized paramilitary operations and so on, with the way in which the early Afrikaner Revolution was policed by the dominant English authorities of the time, who did actually relatively little and indeed acquiesced by and large by the time the Afrikaner Revolution succeeded in taking over the government in 1949. They had clapped a few people in jail during the Second World War for openly supporting Nazi causes and indeed serving as spies for Nazi U-boats who would then sink the Allied troop ships going out from Durban Harbor. They put them in concentration camps. They didn't do what one might have expected, i.e. shoot them. And indeed, some of those people became, one of them in particular, a prime minister in future South Africa.
That's interesting.
Yes.
You, if we could move closer to home for a minute, you've written recently on policy matters, and this in itself is somewhat unusual for a theorist, it seems to me, in criminology perhaps. But if you were asked what would you recommend for America right now in terms of crime prevention, have you got some strategies you could share with us?
Oh, definitely. As you well know, you're the reason why I was forced eventually to consider whether my theorizing had any policy implications. Your idea of getting all us theorists to come clean on what we really thought without any wishy-washy dilly-dallying about the point was a good one. So it forced me to sit down and think through a number of things, and I came out with a number of, you asked for them, you got them, a few cases. That is plain, straight statements, very simple. Don't try to fuzzy it up, qualify it too much, or cite everything in sight. So I did come out with a number of things. For example, against my long-held convictions, I found that I had to come out saying, get rid of the death penalty. I'd been arguing with my spouse years over this. She's always been against it. I was saying, well, maybe in some cases people ought to be killed. But then I became increasingly convinced not only that it's hopeless to think we will eliminate all error and all discrimination in the system, but that the perpetuation of capital punishment in this country is one of the major and most hurtful symbols of our history of racial oppression and racial discrimination. This is, as long as we have capital punishment, legalized judicial murder, as some people call it, as long as we have it, no matter whether it deters or didn't deter, and there's absolutely no convincing evidence of a deterrent effect, it's something that aggravates what is a worsening danger to this country, and that is the racial conflicts which are erupting and which are getting worse, certainly in places such as Southern California, where I live. So that would be one. But generally, I thought that we should begin fighting. As I put it in that chapter in your book, I think that we have to begin pulling together all best available knowledge to fight this sort of automatic and awful kind of syndrome that's going on of everybody involved in politics trying to out-tough one another. Increasingly costly, increasingly counterproductive, and obviously ineffectual wars on this, that, and the other. I think we have to break that, and the only way to do it is to come out and simply challenge the assertions and assumptions, as I know Richard has done on many occasions, of those who would just sort of lead us merrily down the path to destruction, claiming that all this is necessary and that the old ways of trying to help people with their social problems simply didn't work. So we have to go out and fight for social justice and explain to people that all the lies they're being told every day about the nature of crime and the amount of crime and rates of crime and who's doing what, and all the pressures on the police to keep enforcing idiotic legislation, on prosecutors, pressures and temptations to keep pushing for more convictions and longer sentences and so on and so on. All of this is absolutely the wrong way to go. So I've called for organizing National Information Service and basically a counter-propaganda, if you want to say, or counter-information organization. And a lot of other things are recommended as well. But the main point is that all of that is amounted not to changing things piecemeal, but to changing the structures, to changing the system as it has developed, the institutionalization of discrimination, the institutionalization of a kind of political blindness to facts. Indeed, facts which are long since established, and which most of these politicians, I think, know, but then decide on the basis of the latest calculations that they should go with their own get-tough version, even when they know better. Even when they know, for example, and we've known this for decades, don't keep building big warehouses and expect anything other than trouble. We keep building the big warehouses. The politics of this was brought home to me years ago in Canada when they had decided, they had had a national decision, all parties involved, the government, all leading academics, researchers, corrections officials, all agreed no more big prisons to be built. What happens? Next year, less than a year, they announced they're going to build a big new prison in Ontario. Why? Why are they going to build a big new prison? The Québécois had argued that the last big prison built was Archambault, and it made it look as though the French Canadians were the most criminal in the country. So this kind of political pressure built up until finally the government, to prove that they were not discriminating against French Canadians, symbolically or otherwise, had to build the big new prison to house basically English-speaking prisoners, supposedly. And they were off and running with the usual. We get more laws which enable us to imprison more people, and we decided that certain things that hadn't been so serious were serious. And we've been following this, obviously, happily for years now in the United States.
If you were embarking on a career in criminology right now as a student, thinking about doing this, any advice?
I think that I would not want to get into a situation where I was constantly doing nothing but disembodied research, secondary analyses of NORC tapes, or this kind of thing, looking only at statistics. I want to be in a program where you get some hands-on learning. I think that programs, certainly of the future, should incorporate internships, should incorporate some first-hand experience in various ways in the criminal justice system to see how it does work and how it does look. I would, in other words, not want us any longer to maintain, as we have tended to do, the distinction between the academics who are doing the research and teaching others to do research on the one hand, and then the guys who are out there trying to operate the control structures themselves.
You've
I
been...
think we have to get closer and closer. For one thing, we have to be able to know what they're doing without just reading their reports and reading what they tell us they've been doing.
Yeah. You've been very active as a professional, as a scholar in the various associations that you belong to, the American Sociological Association, the American Society of Criminology, the Law and Society Association. You've been president of the North Central
Sociological Association.
Association.
Yes.
You've been president of the American Society of Criminology. Do you have any thoughts about your professional involvements? Has this been satisfying? I presume it's been very satisfying to you.
Very much. I think simply being able to push for a more, in a real sense, a more sociological and perhaps somewhat less individualized criminology and a less sanguine and legalistic approach to the study of legal institutions. It's been good to be in a position to have some influence in these organizations and to have some effect, for example, on program development. What kinds of panels are going to be suggested, who's going to be invited to be featured speakers, and so on. All a way of countering a lot of the kind of assumptions of reality which we were wrong in both socio-legal studies and criminology, as it seemed to me over the years. It was certainly a way of trying to promote a conflict orientation versus the kind of structural functional or moral functionalism, I sometimes call it, that was dominant, and that's why I welcomed the visibility of the Marxists and other radical criminologies and students of law and society. I had plenty of debates and arguments with them, but I thought their points of view should be brought out, their critiques and certainly should be brought out. And my arguments with them usually had to do more with their tendency to forget about the need to do research in a systematic and defensible way, and their assumptions that they already knew what was wrong with society exactly, and they already knew how to take care of things, and that is to promote a revolutionary praxis approach. So I would argue with them on the viability of that revolutionary strategy, which got us into some hot water at times. Argued over the misuses of symbolic politics, attempts to simply manipulate what students thought rather than teach students to think. So we had a lot of shots exchanged back and forth in those years, but the fact that we were exchanging those shots acquired a kind of visibility in itself, and I think we sort of got at the interest of enough mainstream criminologists that they finally decided maybe where there's so much smoke going on, there might be a little fire that was worth paying attention to. So we found that after a while, some of the things that we were battling to introduce into the field as a way of looking at things early on became accepted part of every textbook. Yeah. And that was kind of a fun feeling. Things that were considered far out back in the 60s became kind of, so of course, you know, you're going to have your thing on conflict approaches and this, that, and the other by the end of the 70s, and certainly in the 80s and 90s.
This project is itself a sort of joint project between the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences and the ASC.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Do you see this as...
I belong to both organizations, by the way.
I was going to ask you, do you see this as the future where we should be heading, more collaboration, more uniting of practitioners and scholars, if that is a fair...
Definitely. And for years off and on, I know there's been occasionally someone brings up the idea, particularly book publishers on occasion, have said, why don't the ACJS and the ASC just get together, because we bring the same books twice a year out to both conventions, basically. And you guys are all having the same kind of panels, and there's so many of you who are in both organizations, and so why not just have one convention? Years ago, when I was president, Dorothy Bracey, who was then a CJS president, and I talked about this, and we decided no more attempts to force any kind of mergers, just let this thing eventually happen gradually, because there were too many people who had too many investments of career and so on in the one versus the other kind of organization. And we just let them keep going and growing together and becoming more and more alike and doing the same kinds of things. And after a while, they will look around maybe and say, well, why do we meet twice a year instead of once a year?